In this video, we're going to learn more about protists. Here is some general information about protists and their morphology. Remember that word morphology refers to structure. So protists, most of them are unicellular. Remember, uni means one. So these are mostly single-celled organisms, but there are some multicellular, exceptions to this rule. Some of them are also colonial, meaning that they are unicellular organisms that kind of work together like a multicellular organism, but they are not multicellular because the individual cells are still their own individual living organisms. So the colonial or the colonies that they might form, the cells might take on specific functions that help the colony, but ultimately a cell could be removed from the colony and still survive on its own. And that's not the case with a multicellular organism. So in multicellular organisms, if you take a cell out of the organism, that cell is incapable of surviving on its own. Protists can also vary widely in size. So some of them are microscopic, which you can kind of see in this picture over here. We've got some microscopic ones that are being shown. Or they can be really, really big. So this is a kelp forest here. So this is kelp. And this picture was actually, I believe, taken at an aquarium, but it gives you an idea of how big these kelp organisms can become. They can reach over 200 meters long. That's over 600 feet. And these are common in the Pacific Ocean. Protists overall, they are the most abundant eukaryotic organisms, and they are the most diverse. So as we talk about the different types of protists, you're going to see that they vary in their structure, their function, and their ecological role. They're just all over the place. When it comes to metabolism, and remember metabolism just refers to the chemical reactions that occur in living organisms that essentially are involved in processing nutrients and energy. Now, protists are, I don't want to say flexible because certain protists are only able to do maybe one or the other, but as a group of organisms, they might be able to do any of these types of metabolism. So let's do a quick review. A photoautotroph, these are talking about our photosynthetic organisms. Heterotrophs are organisms that eat other organisms or eat other, we'll say, organic matter. All right, hetero means other, whereas auto means self. So photoautotrophs feed themselves by conducting photosynthesis. Heterotrophs have to feed themselves by eating other organisms. And then a mixotroph means that they can do either or. So they might be able, a single protist might be able to be a photoautotroph depending on the conditions, or they might be able to switch over to being heterotrophs depending on the conditions. A lot of protists also have the ability to move around in their environment, and cilia, flagella, and pseudopods are three of the different ways that different types of protists might be able to move around. So first of all, cilia are these hair-like extensions that are sticking out of the cell membrane, and you can see them here. They're these little hairs right here. And these hairs are able to kind of beat back and forth almost in a wave-like movement. And that the movement of these little hairs, they're actually protein fibers, allows the organism to move around in its environment. And an example that you're maybe familiar with are paramecium. So this would be kind of what a paramecium looks like. Some protists have flagella. Singular is flagellum. So some have one flagellum, some might have multiple flagella. And a flagellum is just a protein filament that is sticking out of the cell, and it can move in a corkscrew-like fashion. So a corkscrew, it can kind of like do that. And that helps the organism to swim in typically the opposite direction, or it might even pull the organism along. It just depends on how the flagellum works. And so an example would be a euglena, and they have these flagella that allow them to move around. Now, pseudopods, pseudo means false and pod means feet. So this word stands for false feet. And you may be familiar with amoeba. And so amoeba have these pseudopods. And what this is you've got the cell membrane here. And you've got the cytoplasm in here. And what happens is that the cell membrane, with the help of the cytoplasm, can actually form these little extensions that are able to grab onto the surface and essentially pull that cell along. When it comes to how they survive, some protists are free living, others are parasitic. And remember, parasitic means that they rely on a host for survival. And we could also call these pathogenic because a parasite is something that harms the host that it's living off of. So it's pathogenic in that the host is going to be negatively affected by the presence of this parasitic protist in this example. And when it comes to reproduction, once again, this gets very complicated with different types of protists, but most protists can reproduce asexually through mitosis. But some protists are able to convert to sexual reproduction during times of environmental stress. And the kind of the benefit of sexual reproduction is that it increases genetic diversity. And increasing genetic diversity, essentially you are kind of shuffling genes around within the population. And you might have some organisms or some protists in this population that are able to survive this stress, whereas others might not. But without that genetic diversity, if it's the wrong kind of stress, it might kill off all of the protists in the population, and then it's become extinct. So increasing genetic diversity allows for at least some individuals in the population to hopefully survive whatever environmental stress is occurring so that the population of the protists can live on, even if certain individuals are still going to be killed by the environmental conditions. Some protists are also able to become dormant, meaning that they are metabolically inactive. And they can form these spores or these cysts that essentially can hang out and stay alive, but not actually, growing or reproducing or feeding until the conditions improve. So it's kind of like hibernation, but for single-celled organisms. And when we talk about environmental stressors, we can talk about things like drought, extreme temperature changes. So if it gets too hot or too cold, things like changes in pH or salinity. These are all things that could potentially stress out an organism and make it become dormant or die. And then if it becomes dormant, it might be able to come back, like kind of become reanimated, if you will. So become metabolically active again once the conditions return to kind of the normal beneficial state.